The sea was unervingly still that morning, too still for war. No gulls, no waves, just a vast grey silence broken only by the faint hum of machinery deep below the surface. Inside the steel belly of the USS Harder, Commander Samuel D. Dealey stood in the red glow of the control room lights, eyes fixed on the periscope. He whispered, "Bearing 09, destroyer approaching." His voice was calm, deliberate, like a man rehearsing death. Above him, the waters of the Philippine Sea churned with unseen violence. The Japanese fleet believed no American submarine could survive in their shallow channels. For months, they'd hunted them like ghosts, pinging sonar across the ocean floor, dropping depth charges into the black. But the Harder wasn't a ghost. It was a hunter. And in the next 4 days, it would carve a legend so shocking that even the Imperial Japanese Navy refused to believe it was real. The logbook recovered from the wreck decades later told only fragments. Half sentences, written in trembling ink. Day 1, first destroyer sighted at dawn. Day 4, 5 confirmed kills. Depth charges everywhere. God help us. No submarine in history had ever done what they did. And yet, when the ocean swallowed them, silence returned, leaving behind only questions, wreckage, and the faint echo of Dealey's final order, "Take her down. All ahead flank. Fade into darkness." The USS Harder slipped through the dawn like a blade through fog. Every man on board felt it, the pressure of the Pacific above them, the weight of history pressing from all sides. The hull creaked with a low metallic groan, and with each sound, the men held their breath. They were 200 feet below, where light no longer reached, and silence had a pulse of its own. Commander Samuel David Dealey stood near the plotting table, a map of the Luzon Strait spread before him. His face, carved with exhaustion and resolve, reflected the dim red of the cabin lights. He'd been awake for 20 hours, eyes drawn constantly to the pencil marks on the chart. Every inch of ink represented a chance to die, or to strike. He murmured, almost to himself, 5 destroyers in these waters. If we move fast enough, they won't see us coming. Someone coughed behind him, Lieutenant Clark, the exec, nervous, young, still clinging to the rhythm of training manuals. "Sir, intelligence says they're on anti-sub patrol. Depth charges loaded." Dealey didn't look up. "Then we'll make them use them." The men laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was the only thing that kept their fear from becoming real. The Harder was no ordinary submarine. It was a Gato-class, long and lean, designed for silent strikes and brutal endurance. Its torpedo tubes were polished, its crew precise. In war, reputation was everything, and Dealey's crew had earned theirs the hard way. They called their captain the destroyer killer. Not out of arrogance, but awe. He had a way of turning the impossible into orders, and orders into miracles. At 0600 hours, sonar picked up the first contact, steady pings bouncing off something massive moving east. A destroyer. The Japanese Minazuki, escorting a convoy toward the southern Philippines. Bearing 270. Speed 15 knots, whispered the sonar man. Dealey's eyes narrowed. He didn't blink. "Prepare tubes 1 through 4. The words moved through the submarine like electricity. Every man came alive, each motion silent, exact. The torpedo crew loaded the weapons, metal sliding into place with a hiss and a thud. Above them, the sea's surface was glass. Beneath, tension built like a heartbeat waiting to stop. Dealey whispered, "Up periscope." The handle turned, and for a second, the captain's world was reduced to a thin circle of shifting blue and gray. He saw it, just a faint outline at the horizon, a shadow cutting through the water. The Minazuki. He timed it in his head. Distance, 2,800 yards. Speed, 15 knots. Angle on the bow, 40 degrees port. He breathed once, slow and even. Then, fire 1. Fire 2. The torpedoes leapt into the silence like silver ghosts. 30 seconds later, the sea exploded. A white plume ripped the air, followed by a muffled thunder that rolled through the deep like a heartbeat breaking. The Harder tilted from the shockwave, instruments rattling. Someone whispered, "Direct hit." Dealey said nothing. He just watched the periscope. The destroyer was breaking apart, fire and smoke blooming over the water like a dying sun. "Down scope," he said. "Take her deep. Fast." The ocean swallowed them whole again. The world above burned and sank. Hours passed in tense silence. The crew spoke little, their world reduced to red lights, the smell of diesel, and the soft ticking of depth gauges. At 1100, sonar picked up another contact. 2 destroyers this time, hunting. The Japanese Navy didn't forgive easily. They were combing the area, dropping charges in patterns meant to crush steel and bone. "Hold at 250 feet, Dealey ordered. The Harder crept through the dark, slower than a man walking. A faint, rhythmic thud began, depth charges rolling into the water. One after another. The first exploded far off, a dull tremor. Then closer. The lights flickered, dust fell from pipes. A man flinched and crossed himself. Dealey didn't move. "Maintain course. Don't surface until I say." He knew fear was contagious. So was courage. Another explosion, this one close enough to make the hull shudder. The pressure in their ears was unbearable. Someone muttered, "They've got our range." Dealey leaned against the table, his voice even. "No. They're guessing." The next moment proved him right. The pings faded, replaced by the fading throb of propellers moving off. The destroyers had given up. For now. The men exhaled all at once. Laughter burst out, ragged, half-mad relief. Dealey smiled faintly. "We're not done yet." That night, when the submarine surfaced to recharge batteries, the air smelled of salt and oil. Stars shimmered like frozen sparks. Some men climbed up for a minute of sky, their faces pale in the starlight. Lieutenant Clark joined the captain on deck. "Sir, 5 ships in 4 days, is that really possible?" Dealey's answer came after a long pause. "Possible isn't the word for it. Necessary is." He looked out across the black horizon. Somewhere out there, Japanese convoys were moving supplies to garrisons that refused to die. Every destroyer he sank meant fewer bombs, fewer bullets, fewer deaths of men he'd never meet. Clark nodded but said nothing. They both knew how this ended. No submarine made history without inviting its own funeral. Below, the radioman intercepted a faint Japanese transmission. Cracked, distant, and terrified. Enemy sub sighted. Multiple destroyers lost. Command disbelief. Orders, destroy immediately. The message cut off mid-sentence. Dealey folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "They don't believe it yet," he said quietly. "They will." The sea around them was calm again, but the quiet wasn't peace, it was the pause before the next hunt. He turned to the crew gathered below deck. "We're heading north. Luzon Strait. More escorts reported there. We go in before sunrise." A murmur rippled through the men, part fear, part faith. Every one of them knew the odds. Every one of them followed anyway. The Harder dove once more, her wake vanishing under the night. Somewhere far above, the surface lay still, indifferent. Beneath, 200 feet down, a single thought pulsed through every man on board: if we die here, make it count. Hours later, Dealey wrote his last entry of the day. His handwriting was steady, disciplined. June 20, 1944, first kill complete. Enemy active. Morale high. If we don't return, remember this: the sea keeps what it loves. He closed the logbook, exhaled, and listened to the hum of engines echoing through the steel hull. The Pacific didn't roar, it whispered. And somewhere in that whisper, the next target was already moving toward them. Morning came without sunlight. Only the faint tremor of machinery, the filtered hum of electric motors, and the taste of recycled air marked time aboard the USS Harder. The crew had stopped trusting clocks, hours stretched like wire under pressure. Beneath 200 feet of cold Pacific water, dawn was an idea, not a color. Commander Dealey stood in the control room again, the same posture, same stillness. Around him, men whispered measurements, bearing, depth, sound contact, each word clipped short, efficient. The map on the plotting table had grown messy with pencil marks and grease, the record of a hunt that was quickly turning into legend. Sonar pinged. Once. Twice. Then, the unmistakable echo of screws turning fast. The sonar man's voice quivered. New contact. Bearing 185. 2 destroyers, closing in fast. Dealey looked up. Japanese convoy route. They're hunting, not running. A few men exchanged glances. The Harder was still reloading torpedoes from the last engagement. 2 tubes were ready. 2. Against destroyers that could move at 30 knots and drop enough explosives to turn steel into splinters. Dealey didn't hesitate. Set course intercept. Full battery. The engines thrummed louder, a vibration deep in the spine. The submarine angled upward, gliding silently through the black, rising toward a world it could only visit to kill or die. Up periscope. The captain's hands moved like ritual. He swept the horizon, then froze. 2 destroyers. Imperial Navy. The Tanakays and Hyanami. Both faster, both armed, both searching. For a moment, Dealey said nothing. Then he whispered, "We strike first." The men around him obeyed without question. They had long since learned that logic had no place in the abyss. Tubes 1 and 2 ready, sir. Range? 1,800 yards. Good. Fire 1. Fire 2. 2 dull thuds echoed through the submarine. The crew counted the seconds. 10. 15. 23. Then, impact. The first torpedo hit amidships. A muffled explosion rolled through the sea, a shockwave that rattled the gauges and dimmed the lights. The second struck moments later, tearing through steel and fire. The sonar man shouted, "Direct hits. Target breaking apart." Cheers erupted, but Dealey raised a hand. Quiet. They're not alone. The second destroyer had seen the explosion. It was turning fast, closing in on their position. The Hyanami's sonar pinged like a heartbeat. "Depth charges incoming," someone yelled. "Take her deep." The Harder dove. The hum of descent filled the room, the metallic groan of pressure on the hull, the hiss of ballast tanks. The first charge detonated above them, shaking the sub so hard men fell to their knees. The second exploded closer, lights flickered, a pipe burst, spraying mist. Hold depth at 250. Another charge. Then another. The sea itself seemed to boil. Inside, it was chaos held together by obedience. A wrench clattered across the deck. Someone cursed under his breath. One man clutched his rosary, mouthing words to a god that felt far above the waves. Then, silence. The destroyer's propellers grew faint, fading into the deep distance. Dealey exhaled. "They think we're dead. Let's prove them wrong." By nightfall, the Harder surfaced again. The crew took turns breathing open air, sharp, cold, and metallic. The sea stretched endless and black, moonlight rippling over the surface like silver over a wound. 2 destroyers sunk. For days of pursuit. Morale remained steady. Enemy resistance fierce. Will not turn back. He closed the notebook and looked out across the waves. "They'll send more," he murmured. Lieutenant Clark leaned beside him. "Sir, That's 4 ships in 3 days. Command's not going to believe it. Dealey smiled, a faint curve of the lips. They will when none come back. He meant it. Every word. The next morning, June 22, 1944, began with a sound the men would never forget, a faint, distant hum that grew into a roar. Multiple propellers, closing fast, reported sonar. 3, maybe 4 destroyers. Dealey's expression didn't change. He stood still for a long moment, then said softly, "Battle stations." The alarm bell rang, a hollow metallic scream that made every man move. Boots pounded against the deck, hands spun valves, torpedo doors opened with hydraulic sighs. "Depth, 75 feet, ordered Dealey. "We'll attack from the thermocline." The ocean above shimmered with thermal layers, invisible walls that bent sonar and confused enemies. Dealey used them like camouflage. Range? 2,000 yards. Speed? 15 knots, heading north. Dealey's eyes flicked to the periscope. The enemy formation was tight, 3 destroyers in a triangular escort pattern. The lead ship, Matsuke's, cut through the water like a blade. He exhaled. "All tubes ready. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. The torpedoes launched in sequence, 3 white trails cutting invisibly through the deep. Seconds crawled. Then, the first detonation tore the ocean apart. A column of fire burst upward. The Matsuke's split amidships, its bow vanishing beneath the waves. The 2 trailing destroyers veered sharply, confusion and terror radiating through their radio chatter, snippets intercepted by the Harder's operators. Submarine contact, impossible range, return fire, drop pattern. Then, static. Dealey gave no time for panic to fade. Hard to port. Reload tubes 1 and 2. We're not finished. The second torpedo spread hit the Tachibana, crippling its stern. Flames rose on the horizon like a funeral pyre. For 4 days, the Pacific had been quiet. Now it screamed. The Japanese fleet believed it was under attack by multiple submarines. They reported phantom contacts, false sonar echoes, ghost torpedoes streaking through the depths. Panic spread faster than the explosions. In Tokyo, dispatches from the front described an unseen enemy that strikes and vanishes. Inside the Harder, the air grew thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Batteries were low. Torpedoes nearly spent. But Dealey pressed on. He knew this was more than war, it was psychology. Every sinking shattered the illusion of Japanese naval invincibility. Lieutenant Clark finally spoke what everyone was thinking. "Sir, we're outnumbered, low on power, hunted from all directions. Maybe it's time to pull back." Dealey turned slowly, meeting his eyes. "Clark, how many ships have we sunk?" "5, sir." "Then we leave when they stop sending them." There was no arrogance in his tone, only certainty, the kind that makes men follow into hell. The sea above churned again. More destroyers arrived, their searchlights slicing the darkness. Depth charges in the water. The first explosion was distant. The second wasn't. Metal screamed. Lights went out. The hull shuddered violently. A valve burst open, spraying seawater across the compartment. Damage control. Men scrambled with rags, clamps, anything they could grab. The sub tilted slightly, 5 degrees, then 6. "Level her out." Someone shouted, rudder jammed. Dealey gripped the railing, his knuckles white. "Hold fast. Rig for silent running." The engines slowed. Every light went red. Every man froze. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Outside, the destroyers dropped another pattern, 6 charges, one after another. The sea convulsed. Each blast rolled like thunder through the steel shell. And then, quiet again. Minutes passed. Then hours. Finally, sonar reported, all contacts moving off. We're clear. The silence that followed wasn't relief, it was disbelief. They were alive. Again. Dealey whispered, they'll write this off as luck. Lieutenant Clark looked at him. And what do you call it, sir? Dealey's eyes stayed on the compass. Det. When night returned, the Harder surfaced once more, battered but breathing. The men emerged into cool air, their faces pale from exhaustion and oil. Below, the radioman intercepted a new transmission. Japanese Naval Command, urgent, shaken. 5 destroyers lost in 4 days. Believed multiple enemy subs. Orders, retreat and regroup. The message repeated 3 times, disbelief growing in each. Clark read it aloud to the crew. A hush fell over them. One man whispered, we did it. Dealey shook his head. We're not done until they stop chasing ghosts. He looked at the horizon, the same dark line that had followed them for days. Somewhere out there, Japan's navy was bleeding, and the Harder was the wound. He returned below deck, opened his logbook, and wrote slowly. 5 ships. 4 days. Crew exhausted but unbroken. The enemy still hunts the shadows we leave behind. He paused, pen trembling. If this is to be our end, then let the ocean remember our names. He closed the book. The engines hummed. The lights flickered. The sea was silent again. But deep down, beneath the stillness, something in the Pacific was watching. Fade to black. The Pacific had begun to feel alive, breathing, listening, waiting. Every sound aboard the USS Harder seemed magnified in that silence. The hiss of oxygen, the tap of a wrench, the soft scrape of boots on steel. Each noise was a risk. Every whisper, a beacon. It was the 5th day. Dealey stood alone at the periscope, eyes swollen from sleeplessness. The surface was calm, but the calm was deceptive. He knew the Japanese Navy was no longer guessing, they were hunting him specifically now. A single submarine that had sunk 5 destroyers in less than a week had become a myth, an insult to their pride. He could feel it in the stillness. Somewhere out there, they were waiting for him too. Below deck, the men worked in silence. The smell of sweat and diesel filled the narrow corridors. Torpedo rooms were nearly empty, only 2 weapons remained. Batteries were drained, and air scrubbers were failing. But none of them spoke about it. They all knew something Dealey never said aloud, legends don't retreat. Captain, Clark whispered, breaking the silence. We've got a transmission from command. Dealey turned slowly. Let's hear it. Clark handed him the decoded message. Enemy convoys moving south from Toi Toi. Heavily escorted. Avoid engagement if possible. Return to base for refit. Dealey read it twice. Then he tore the message in half. We don't have time for orders, he said quietly. We have time for one more strike. Clark hesitated. Sir, we're at half battery. Air quality's dropping. The men trust me, Dealey interrupted. His voice was calm, but it cut through the room like steel. And I trust the ocean to keep us hidden one more day. They set course north. The sky was low, the sea pale and endless. Waves rolled like breathing lungs. Every few hours, sonar picked up faint echoes, propellers, distant depth charges, convoys passing somewhere in the fog. At 1,400 hours, sonar reported a new contact. Multiple ships, bearing 085. Convoy formation. Dealey leaned over the plotting table. Distance. 3,000 yards. He exhaled, a quiet sigh. One last dance. The Harder slid into position. The periscope rose, its glass eye breaking the surface like a whisper. Dealey adjusted the focus. What he saw froze him. 6 ships, 2 large transports and 4 destroyers, moving in formation. Japanese flags flapped in the wind. Men moved along the decks. Somewhere among them, radio officers were likely already whispering rumors about the phantom submarine that refused to die. Dealey lowered the periscope. All tubes ready. Clark whispered, "Sir, that's 4 destroyers. That's suicide." Dealey's eyes were calm. "That's history. Fire 1. Fire 2. The torpedoes streaked into the deep, silent, invisible. 20 seconds later, 2 columns of water erupted skyward. The Tankes, another destroyer, split in 2. Alarms blared from the remaining ships. The convoy scattered. "Reload." Dealey barked. "Tubes empty, sir." The captain didn't flinch. "Then dive. Take us to 300 feet. The sea swallowed them whole again. Moments later, the first depth charge detonated above them. The sound was biblical, like mountains collapsing underwater. Then another. And another. The Harder shook violently. Bolts rattled loose, dust fell like snow from the pipes. A gauge cracked. "Forward trim unstable," someone shouted. "Compensate manually." Dealey gripped the railing, watching the depth gauge climb past 280 feet. 290. 310. Hold her steady. The pressure was immense. The steel hull groaned like a dying creature. "Damage in the aft compartment," cried the chief engineer. Dealey turned. "Seal it." "But, sir." "Seal it." There was a pause, then the heavy clang of the watertight door slamming shut. Behind it, 2 men were trapped. Their voices could be heard faintly, pounding, shouting. Then silence. The submarine steadied. Dealey looked down. His jaw clenched, but his eyes stayed dry. "Maintain depth." He whispered under his breath, "The sea keeps what it loves." Hours passed. The destroyers above continued dropping charges in a pattern, a deadly rhythm of sound and silence. The Harder drifted in the blackness, battery almost gone, air thick with carbon dioxide. Men coughed, sweat dripping from their faces. Some prayed. Others stared at nothing. Lieutenant Clark's voice cracked. "Sir, if they keep at this pace, we won't have air by morning." Dealey nodded. "Then we surface before sunrise." Clark stared at him. "Surface?" "Sir, that's necessary," Dealey interrupted again. The first light of dawn was gray and merciless. The Harder surfaced miles from its last engagement, its deck slick with salt. The crew climbed up for air that felt almost holy. The sky was streaked with smoke from distant fires. Dealey stood on deck, binoculars in hand, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Only the vast indifferent sea. Clark joined him. "You think they're gone?" Dealey shook his head. "No. They're waiting." He was right. Within minutes, the faint echo of engines rolled across the waves. Then came the glint of metal on the horizon, one last destroyer, charging straight toward them. "Dive! Emergency dive!" The submarine plunged beneath the surface. Sirens wailed. Men raced to their posts. Depth 150 feet. Bearing 270. Enemy closing fast. Dealey looked through the periscope one last time. The destroyer was almost on top of them, turning hard to drop its load. He whispered, "Prepare stern tube. 1 left." The final torpedo was loaded. Range? 800 yards. Speed? 20 knots in closing. Dealey breathed once, then spoke with quiet precision, "Fire." The torpedo left the tube, a single streak of vengeance through the black. 10 seconds later, the destroyer erupted in a plume of fire. A massive explosion tore through its bow. The sea rolled, glowing orange beneath the smoke. The crew erupted in disbelief. Direct hit. Dealey didn't celebrate. He only said, "Take her deep. This time, we vanish." They dove to 300 feet. For the first time in days, there were no more pings, no more engines, no more explosions. Just the sound of the sea closing over their heads. Dealey stood at the chart table, writing in his log. His handwriting was slow now, labored. 6 ships confirmed. Batteries near zero. Air foul. Crew steady. If we do not return, tell them we fought until the water took our names. He looked up. The lights flickered. A low groan filled the hull, metal under pressure, weary of defying the ocean. He whispered to himself, "We've given her enough." Clark looked at him. "Sir." Dealey smiled faintly. "Just thinking how quiet it'll be once we stop moving." The hull creaked louder. Then, silence. Somewhere in that silence, something shifted. A final charge detonated far above them. The shockwave rippled downward, slower this time, but heavy enough to make every bolt scream. A pipe burst near the aft section. Water hissed in through hairline cracks. The lights went out. In the dark, someone whispered, "Captain." Dealey's voice came back, steady, calm, "Rig for surface. One last time." But the submarine didn't rise. The pumps failed. The depth gauge needle slid past 350. 400. 450. Someone prayed. Someone sobbed. The rest waited. Dealey stood at the periscope well, one hand resting on the steel. "Clark," he said softly, "send the message." "What message, sir?" "Tell command. Harder still hunting." Clark hesitated. Then nodded. He tapped the key, the final Morse transmission sent into the black. Enemy fleet attacked. Depth charges heavy. Still engaging. It was the last message ever received from the USS Harder. Moments later, the pressure reached its limit. The sea, patient and infinite, took what it was owed. No one screamed. The final sound was steel bending, breaking, then nothing at all. Decades later, divers found the wreck resting in silence, 300 feet beneath the surface. The hull was cracked, the periscope bent, the name barely visible beneath a layer of coral and time. Inside, the logbook was still there. The ink had faded, but one sentence was clear. "We are not ghosts. We are proof that courage sinks only once." For days after the Harder's final transmission, the Pacific remained strangely quiet. No new attacks. No new sightings. The Imperial Japanese Navy declared the area clear, confident the Phantom submarine had finally been destroyed. Yet, deep in Tokyo's Naval Command, whispers circulated. Some claimed they'd intercepted false radio echoes, others swore they heard the Harder's call sign days after its supposed death. Even in war, silence could lie. The ocean above the Luzon Strait rolled endlessly, untroubled by the secrets beneath. Fishermen who later passed through the area spoke of strange lights flickering below the waves at night, pale blue glows that vanished when boats drew near. They didn't know it, but they were sailing above one of the most haunting graves in naval history. The Harder and her 79 men rested below, sealed in steel and memory. But the war didn't pause for mourning. In a dim communications bunker on the island of Fremantle, Australia, U.S. Navy radio officers received the Harder's last coded message. Enemy fleet attacked. Depth charges heavy. Still engaging. It arrived just after midnight, June 24, 1944. No further signals followed. At first, command believed it was interference. The Pacific was vast and cruel, transmissions often disappeared into static. But after 48 hours of silence, the truth began to take shape. Commander Samuel Dealey, the destroyer killer, was gone. The official report was cautious, missing in action. But those who'd served with him knew what that really meant. One of his fellow submarine captains, Lieutenant Commander E. D. Blanchard, wrote in his diary. He did not vanish. He fulfilled his course. The sea only claimed what it already owned. The word spread through the fleet. In every mess hall, every dockside bar, every submarine crew's quarters, men repeated them quietly, half prayer, half promise. 2 months later, a captured Japanese document confirmed what everyone had feared. Naval Command reported. Enemy submarine sank 6 destroyers within 4 days. Believed destroyed after final depth charge attack by CD-22 near Dealey Bay. 6 ships. 4 days. A feat so astonishing that Japanese officers refused to believe it had been the work of one submarine. Some suggested the Americans had launched a coordinated wolf-pack strike. Others, more superstitious, claimed the Harder was a spirit of vengeance, an undersea phantom haunting their convoys. The Imperial Navy issued a quiet directive: all surviving crews are to avoid the Luzon Strait unless ordered. Fear had infected discipline. One submarine had changed an ocean. Back at Fremantle, the crew of the USS Harder, a sister sub that had served alongside Harder, was the first to learn the truth. When their captain, Lieutenant Commander Frank Haler, gathered his men on deck, no one spoke for a long time. The sea wind howled across the pier. Finally, he said, "Dealey's gone." But he took half their fleet with him. The men nodded slowly. Some smiled, not out of joy, but defiance. They knew what that kind of courage cost. One sailor removed his cap, whispered, "He died where he belonged, beneath the hunt." In Washington, Dealey's name began to move quietly through the corridors of command. Reports came in from multiple sources confirming his kills. Intelligence compiled enemy radio chatter describing the panic that followed. Senior officers reviewed his record: 5 previous patrols, 16 confirmed sinkings, dozens of enemy vessels damaged. When the Medal of Honor citation was drafted months later, the language was stark and simple. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The rest was silence. His wife, Edwina Dealey, received the telegram in late 1945. The words were as formal as they were final. "The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you that your husband, Commander Samuel D. Dealey, is presumed dead in action." She didn't cry. Not right away. She kept the telegram folded on the kitchen table, next to the photograph of her husband smiling in his uniform, sunlight catching the edge of his cap. Neighbors said she would sit there for hours, reading his last letters. One of them ended with the line, "If I don't return, remember that the sea is only cruel to those who never understood her." Years passed. The war ended. The world rebuilt itself atop the ruins of memory. But among submariners, the legend of the Harder only grew. In naval academies, recruits studied its patrols as lessons in both brilliance and madness. Historians later described Dealey as the man who weaponized audacity. What they rarely mentioned was what it felt like inside that steel coffin: the endless pressure, the suffocating air, the fear that came not from dying, but from knowing you would never be found. When a diver named Robert Conrad first located the Harder's wreck decades later, he wrote in his log, "At 320 feet, visibility poor. Hull intact. Forward section collapsed. A name faintly visible, Harder." He described it like seeing a face beneath glass. The ship wasn't broken, it was sleeping. Coral had grown along the bow, soft as frost. Fish darted through open hatches. The silence felt sacred. He surfaced shaking. "They're still down there," he told the crew. Every one of them, waiting for orders. But even death couldn't contain memory. In 1999, the U.S. Navy held a ceremony over the coordinates of the Harder's final resting place. A destroyer escort sailed to the site, its deck lined with veterans in dress whites. Among them stood gray-haired men who had once served on submarines just like hers, men who had lived because Dealey's courage had drawn the enemy's fire. As the ship slowed to a halt, the chaplain read from the Psalms. The sea was calm, uncharacteristically so, as if listening. Then the commanding officer stepped forward, holding a sealed metal capsule. Inside were the names of all 79 men of the Harder, typed neatly on a single sheet of paper. He spoke quietly. They did not go quietly. They went deeper. The capsule was lowered into the ocean. The sound of chains rattling faded, replaced by the soft hiss of water. It disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by blue. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as the engine started again, a gust of wind swept across the deck, carrying the faint scent of salt and oil, the same air those men had breathed in their final hours. Home. History would record the Harder's final patrol as a tactical masterpiece, a string of ambushes so precise that analysts decades later still debated how Dealey had pulled it off with failing batteries and limited torpedoes. But numbers and tactics could never explain what drove a man to keep fighting in the dark, beneath crushing tons of water, against an enemy he could barely see. It wasn't orders. It wasn't glory. It was something older, deeper, a defiance that lived in every sailor who understood that the sea doesn't forgive weakness. Dealey's men had carried that defiance with them into the depths. In the official Navy archives, there is a brief note beside the Harder's file, written in blue ink by an anonymous clerk in 1946. It reads simply: Final patrol, success beyond expectation. Crew lost, but not defeated. Those 6 words are all that remain of the submarine that terrified the Imperial Navy. Sometimes, late at night, sailors passing through the Luzon Strait report hearing faint metallic sounds beneath the waves, echoes that come and go like heartbeat pulses. Some say it's just sonar reflections. Others believe it's the Harder still out there, running silent, hunting in the dark. The ocean never forgets. It only waits. Fade to black. When the war ended in 1945, Tokyo Bay filled with wreckage. The flags of surrender fluttered weakly in the humid air. But while the world cheered for peace, the Pacific still held its secrets. Somewhere below those waves, steel tombs whispered of unseen battles. Among them, USS Harder. For decades, she remained a ghost. No wreck found. No crew recovered. Just silence. Yet that silence carried weight, the kind that lingers in the hearts of those who remember what courage sounds like before it vanishes. In the years that followed, history books struggled to capture her story. The official record said, sunk, June 24, 1944, near Dealey Bay, Philippines. Depth charges by Japanese escort CD-22. But records are cold. They lack the tremor of breath, the smell of diesel oil, the pulse of men who waited in the dark for orders that never came. In 1951, during post-war interrogations, a Japanese officer named Lieutenant Haruto Senda described that final engagement. His testimony, translated and archived in the Naval Historical Center, remains chilling. The submarine would not die. Even after 30 depth charges, it moved. We could hear the engines changing pitch. It was, mocking us. He paused, and the translator noted his hands trembled. When the sea finally went quiet, we cheered. But that night, I dreamt I saw their periscope again, circling us under the moonlight. I have not slept soundly since. For the Japanese destroyer crews, the Harder had become a curse. They nicknamed her Oni no Umi no Hibi, the demon sea serpent. Even after her destruction, captains would whisper warnings to their men before night patrols. Beware the serpent that does not surface. The psychological damage she left behind ran deeper than her torpedoes ever could. Back in the United States, the surviving families of the Harder's crew gathered every June for remembrance services. They would place 79 candles on the water at dawn, watching the light drift until the sea swallowed the flames. Among them was Chief Torpedoman John Kane's daughter, born just months before her father disappeared. Every year she read from his final letter. If I come back, it will be through stories told by men who knew what fear smelled like, and faced it anyway. Those words became the unofficial epitaph of the Harder. In 1975, sonar scans from a Philippine research vessel picked up an anomaly, a long, narrow object at a depth of 330 feet off Dealey Bay. Divers attempted a descent but failed. The currents were too strong. For years, the coordinates sat forgotten, filed away under unconfirmed submarine contact. It wasn't until 2004 that an American expedition team returned. They used side-scan sonar to create an image of the wreck. And when the outline appeared on their monitors, the room fell silent. There she was, upright, bow slightly tilted, a single torpedo door half open. The hull still bore faint letters, HARDER. Rust and coral had consumed much of her skin, but the form was unmistakable. The divers described a haunting serenity, no sign of violence, no massive rupture. Just a ship resting in perpetual watch. They left a bronze plaque at the site. USS Harder SS 257, here lies the destroyer killer. Her silence is her victory. For historians, the discovery offered closure. But for veterans, it reopened wounds. Commander Dealey had become more than a name, he was a symbol of impossible defiance. Every sailor who had ever crept beneath enemy lines, who had listened to the ticking of depth charges and prayed the next one wouldn't hit, felt something stir inside when they heard his story. Because the truth was simple, the Harder didn't fight to win. She fought so others could survive. Each destroyer she sank wasn't just a number, it was one less ship waiting to ambush an American convoy, one less nightmare for another submarine somewhere in that vast, indifferent ocean. The men aboard Harder knew this. They weren't chasing medals. They were carving a path through hell so that others might reach home. In 2010, a Japanese historian named Kazuo Nakamura published The Demon of Dealey Bay, based on Imperial Navy archives and personal interviews with surviving sailors. His closing line was both an admission and an apology. She sank our ships, but she also sank our arrogance. The book was banned from several nationalist circles in Japan. Yet it became required reading in naval history programs across Europe and the US, a testament to how a single submarine forced the world to reckon with the psychology of war itself. Because beneath every victory was a tragedy. Beneath every act of heroism, a burial. In 2018, the U.S. Navy formally recognized the wreck of the USS Harder as a war grave. A remotely operated camera descended into the depths, capturing images that few have ever seen. Inside the conning tower, control levers still gleamed faintly under layers of sediment. A single coffee mug rested beside a collapsed bulkhead. A boot, its laces still tied, drifted in the current like a memory refusing to settle. No bones remained, only shadows, outlines, and the quiet hum of eternity. When the footage was shown to the descendants of the crew, some cried. Others simply stood in silence. One man, a grandson of Lieutenant Commander Dealey, whispered, "He's home." But war never truly ends, it only changes its shape. Every new generation of submariners still studies the Harder's patrols, not for glory, but for understanding. They analyze her ambush patterns, her evasive tactics, her willingness to stay close to enemy escorts. Yet no simulator, no manual, no digital model can capture what truly made her dangerous: conviction. Dealey once wrote in his personal notes, "A submarine's greatest weapon is not her torpedoes, but her silence." And that silence remains unbroken. Even today, at the coordinates 15 degrees 49 minutes north, 119 degrees 59 minutes east, the water moves strangely. Sonar pings return uneven echoes, as though the sea itself hesitates to disturb what lies below. Local fishermen tell stories, how, on calm nights, their compasses spin for no reason, how their nets tear when lowered too deep. Some claim to have seen bubbles rising from the dark, long after the engines stopped running. They call the place, the breathing sea. One elder fisherman, interviewed in 2022, said quietly, "It's not haunted. Modern sailors pass through the Luzon Strait, they still pay tribute. They dim the lights, run silent for 1 hour, and transmit a single coded pulse, 3 dots. 1 dash. 3 dots. SOS. A salute, not for help, but for remembrance. The Pacific has many graves, but only one legend sleeps beneath her like a whisper that never fades. The Harder was more than a submarine. She was a defiance made metal, a reminder that sometimes, the greatest victories are written in silence and paid for with everything. As one naval historian wrote, her end was not defeat. It was punctuation, an ellipsis at the bottom of a page written in saltwater. On June 24 each year, at Pearl Harbor, the bell of the Bowfin Submarine Museum tolls 79 times. Each ring echoes across the water, a countdown to memory. Visitors often ask why the bell sounds different that day, slower, heavier. The curator always gives the same answer. Because that's how the ocean remembers. If you stand near the water long enough, sometimes the wind carries a faint metallic echo, the sound of ballast tanks, the whisper of compressed air, the rhythm of a heartbeat that stopped 8 decades ago. It's easy to dismiss it as imagination. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the Harder, still patrolling, still waiting, still reminding us that courage doesn't vanish, it just dives deeper. And in the eternal darkness of the Pacific, her silence endures like a hymn. If this story moved you, please like this video. Subscribe for more forgotten World War II stories. Comment where you're watching from, Texas, Germany, Australia. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.